It is Tuesday, May the 5th, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining the social, economic, and geostrategic concerns in a world ever-changing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I am Bill Whalen, a Hoover Institution Research Fellow and the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism. For those of you tuning in for the first time, this is a conversation in which three Hoover Senior Fellows, three GoodFellows as we like to call them, offer their unique insights into what lies ahead in these uncertain times. Let's meet the GoodFellows, beginning with John Cochrane, an economist and the Hoover Institution's Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. John's also the author of the Grumpy Economist blog, which you should definitely bookmark as a daily read. John, how are things in your role today?
Yeah, I'm doing great, thanks.
Very good. We're also graced by the presence of Niall Ferguson, the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow and a renowned historian and author. He's also the host of Niall Ferguson's Networld, a three-part PBS series on the intersection of social media, technology, and the spread of cultural movements. Niall, I'd like to wish you a happy Cinco de Mayo.
I'm not sure they have that in Montana, but I'll accept the greetings and send mine back to you. Happy 5th of May.
Thank you, and I trust you're stocked on tequila for this afternoon.
I don't think they have that in Montana either, but there are certainly forms of hard liquor on the premises. Let me just say that.
Very good. Our third good fellow, last but certainly not least, and more of a Scotch man than a tequila drinker, I think, is Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He is the Hoover Institution's Fuad Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow, and prior to coming west to Hoover, he was the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. General McMaster is also the author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. Its release date is September 15th, I believe, but you can pre-order it right now on Amazon. Hello, HR.
Hello, Bill. Good to be with you. Good to be with you, John and Neil.
And just for the record, every book that you sell on Amazon, the three of us get a cut of it, right? I hear silence. I guess your audio went dead.
Right.
Gentlemen, let's talk today. The topic I want to bring up today is war, more specifically the use of the term war. If you follow American politics and policy, this is a very familiar word. The 1960s saw a war on poverty. The 1970s brought us a war on inflation. The 1980s, a war on drugs. The first decade of the 21st century featured a war on terror. The second decade, a politically driven war on women. And now this decade, an introduction to a war on the coronavirus, or as some call it, the Corona War. Dr. Tom Friedman, he is the former director of the Centers for Disease Control. He's prophesized about a, quote, long war ahead of us. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, he's called in his constituents to support what he calls the troops in this case being healthcare workers. Cuomo has also said of healthcare workers, and I quote, "They are the soldiers." Then we have the commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, who has labeled himself a wartime president. Now, we have one good fellow on this broadcast who served in combat and has seen warfare in the traditional meaning of the term. I'd be very interested in what he thinks about the use of war. Another good fellow may have thoughts on what it means for America to actually transition to a wartime economy, as we did in the 1940s. But let's begin with the third good fellow, our resident historian. Niall Ferguson, you're the author of at least two books that have the word war in it. One is War of the World, 20th Century Conflict and the Descent of the West, and the other, The Pity of War, Explaining World War I. In your estimation, does war apply to pandemic?
Not really, although, of course, there is at least one similarity, and that's the suddenness of the shock that this pandemic has administered to governments all around the world. I have a new paper on this subject, which is going to be launched on the Hoover History Workshop, or rather working group seminar this week. And in it, I point out that in many ways, there is a resemblance between the way the pandemic suddenly burst upon the world and the way World War I broke out. But there the resemblances end. In the great conventional wars of the 20th century, it was young men who found themselves suddenly plucked out of their normal routines and sent off to fight. Whereas in a pandemic, and particularly in this pandemic, COVID-19, it's actually the elderly, disproportionately male elderly, but the elderly who are most at risk. And the young who really aren't so much at risk from the virus find themselves rather in the opposite situation from their predecessors in 1914 or 1939, being told to just sit and cool their heels at home, not to go to work, not to go out. So it's very different in that respect. John, I'm sure will point out that there's a strong resemblance in the way in which the pandemic's impacting public finances. We're seeing this blowout of the deficit and expansion of central bank balance sheets. Traditionally, those were associated with wars rather than with peacetime. So I think there are resemblances. I think I kind of recoil a bit when prime ministers and presidents try to cast themselves in some sense as the heirs of let's say, Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, because this does seem like a profoundly different challenge. We're up against germs, not Germans, and it's just different. And I think this is the last point I'll make, psychological impact's different. There's something real about the way that a nation unites, at least at the beginning of a war. You can't really say that we've seen that in the wake of this pandemic. So, yeah, I think this is one of these analogies that's useful more because it forces us to focus on the differences between the two kinds of disaster.
Okay, John Cochrane, let's talk about a wartime economy.
Yeah, so this isn't a war. This is a public health crisis. And governments face, I'd say, three kinds of huge, big, sudden challenges: wars, civil wars, and public health crises. They're different. They have some similarities. There are times of big national crisis where governments do big things, but they are different. I would start with one of the analogies to World War II is the command economy. How did we produce Liberty ships? The invocation of the Defense Production Act. And we are now seeing the government taking over. Our economy can't seem to produce 50-cent face masks, so the government's going to take over and command their production. That's just a terrible analogy. The stuff we had to buy in World War II, tanks, ships, airplanes, cost a lot of GDP and took a lot of the industrial capacity. We're just trying to ramp up production on stuff that is trivial fractions of the money in the economy. And if we were simply willing to say, we'll pay $10 a piece, we could get all the face masks in the world. So I think, in fact, the war analogy and the attempt to put in price controls and haggle over 50 cents on face masks rather than just spend what it takes has been bad for the task at hand, which is to organize society, to help society organize itself, but does not require direct expenditure. Now, Neil mentioned the government is spending a huge amount, but we're not buying tanks and ships and airplanes. We're sending money to people so that they can pay their rent. These are transfers. These are not purchases. It has the same effect of ramping up the deficit. Taxpayers will have to pay it off, and we can talk about the likelihood of that happening. But it's a quite different feature. Like war, like efforts for the government to run things, as we've mentioned before, FUBAR and SNAFU were acronyms invented by our grandfathers. World War II's efforts for the government to send stuff around were just as chaotic as the current ones. Generals had to try to get supplies as people are trying to get masks now. And there, I think the analogy is hurting us because, we could much more easily produce tests and masks. Our problems are not supply lines in the way. The problems are the FDA and regulations in the way. All the things we hear of, potatoes rotting in the field. Why? Well, because we didn't have properly labeled bags to send them to grocery stores instead of restaurants. It's kind of sad. Like World War II, private innovation is really a wonderful thing going on now. Not much less spurred by the government than in World War II, but the labs who are coming up with tests and vaccines and so forth are really going to prove, if anything, decisive in this. In World War II, there was a huge amount of innovation. In 9 months, from idea to flying, they got the P-51 going. But that was much more government involved. And the last comment I'll make here, so to view our healthcare workers as soldiers, I think, is incorrect. Our healthcare workers are our healthcare workers. They are the medics. They are picking up the damage, but they are not directly fighting the virus. They are simply helping people survive it once they get it. Public health should be our soldiers, but we don't have much of a public health response going right now. So we're just trying to get through it. No, it's not a war.
Okay, HR, two questions for you. First of all, how comfortable are you with dubbing civilians soldiers, as John Cochrane just mentioned? But secondly, let's talk about the wartime mentality. You've gone into battle, and a certain mindset has to prevail if you're to succeed in a war. How does a military mindset translate to a civilian mindset if we're going to actually talk about this being warfare against germs, not Germans, as Neil said?
Well, I had the privilege today, actually, to talk with a number of healthcare workers who are in the middle of this crisis, and they were asking questions really about what we're talking about. Is this analogous to your experience leading soldiers in combat? And of course, it's not war, and I agree with Neil and John, but I do think that there are analogies to be made that are helpful. To get to your first question, Bill, on our healthcare workers warriors. Of course, they're not warriors in connection with the same warrior ethos that my friend Christopher Coker writes about in a great book by that title. But there are elements of the ethos of healthcare workers that are quite analogous to the ethos of soldiers. In particular, the ethos, the aspect of the ethos that has to do with self-sacrifice. Nobody goes into these healthcare jobs, to make a lot of money or to have an easy life. They know they're gonna make sacrifices. And then also, I think a key element of the warrior ethos is that warriors are bound together by a covenant among the fellow warriors based on their expectations of each other. And they're also bound together and valued by society based on society's expectations of them. And I think what we're seeing is our healthcare workers rise to that occasion. And so in a sense, in a metaphorical sense, they are warriors, although it's important to understand the differences. In terms of the degree to which the metaphor of war is useful, I think it can be useful if it's not overdone and if it doesn't cloud understanding of what real war is. And of course, war is fundamentally a contest of wills, right? Karl von Clausewitz, who we all love to quote and read, the 19th century philosopher of war, said that winning in war really requires convincing your enemy that your enemy has been defeated. And while we can't convince psychologically that this virus that has been defeated, we could defeat ourselves, right? If we don't mobilize the will necessary to come together as Americans and do what's necessary to get through this crisis together. So it is a contest of wills to a certain extent, this battle against the pandemic. Of course, we know that war is human, that war unleashes a psychological dynamic that defies any kind of prediction oftentimes. And so it's important for us, I think, to recognize the psychological dimension of this and not panic and work together and to focus really on innovation, which I think is another useful analogy. Mm-hmm. There's an old saying that the military is always ready to fight its last war. And Neil, as a historian, knows that typically the militaries who have the greatest difficulty at the outset of a war are those who studied the previous war only superficially. And so it's important for us to really learn the lessons of this pandemic. Not, of course, I think we'll be well beyond the complacency associated with how rapidly SARS faded away. But we'll have an opportunity really to understand better how to innovate in the medical field as well, how to mobilize the resources necessary to overcome. But I think the final aspect of I think a pandemic that is analogous to war is that the future course of events in war is impossible to predict, and progress is never linear. Because again, to quote Clausewitz, war is a continuous interaction of opposites. It has a lot to do with really your enemy, in this case, the pandemic, having a say in what does a second wave look like? How does it come back? And then also that war is uncertain because of what John mentioned, right? Is that everything is hard, right? So what Clausewitz said is war is like movement in a resistant element. Because even the simplest things are difficult. And I think that's because of the psychological dimension of war and the profoundly human dimension of war having to do with emotion. And so I think it can help us think better about what it takes to lead in a situation like this. And to get to the second part, I mean, I think what's most relevant is that you build confidence to overcome fear in battle. That confidence comes from your own individual confidence and your ability to stand up to the enemy in combat. But it really comes from confidence in your gear, your equipment, whether it's a therapy or a vaccine or PPE or ventilators or everything we need to fight this. But it really comes from confidence in your comrades and confidence in your leadership. And so, yeah, again, it's not war, but I do think, as I've gone on about this for probably too long, that there are analogies toward that are useful in helping us think about how to get through this crisis and prepare for the next one.
HR, sorry, can I maybe just throw in a quick thought? One of the striking differences between the great wars of the 20th century and the more recent wars that you yourself have been involved with has been that for most ordinary Americans, the wars that were waged in Iraq and Afghanistan were very distant events with which they had minimal contact unless a family member happened to be in our all-volunteer force. And in some ways, this is one of the paradoxes about using the war analogy. We did actually a couple of wars that most people barely noticed, that they read about, saw on TV, but really weren't directly impacted by, whereas the pandemic affects everybody's life. And in that sense, it is a bit more like a 20th century disaster. The other thing about it is, and this goes to your point, HR, about the uncertainties of war, nobody knows when it will end. People kind of want it to be over really soon, ideally just around Memorial Day. I hear that kind of thing from members of the administration that you served in. But that's a bit like hoping World War I would be over by Christmas 1914. Pandemics are definitely not events that last just a few months. They're typically 2-year events, although it could be longer than that if this virus turns out to surprise us in nasty ways. For example, if it turns out to be really difficult to come up with a vaccine despite all the creativity that's going into research on that subject. So I think it's that uncertainty about time frame that really does remind me of war. If you read diaries of people who were mixed up in World War I and World War II, they had no idea when the damn thing was going to end and when they were going to get their lives back to normal. And I think we have that sense at the moment. When exactly do we get back to normal? And will we ever get back to normal? Could it be that the changes are going to be as profound in our lives as the changes wrought by the world wars? That's the thought that I've been plagued by this week.
If I may add too, in a sense, it's more like the home front of World War II. The challenge is to organize the victory gardens and the scrap drives and the other stuff that was going on in World War II. Very much like a war. And I think here's where we really could learn some lessons. All the military history I've read is a history of chaos and improvisation. You try something, it doesn't work. But then you learn fast and adapt the tactics as things go on. We try an attack here, doesn't work. Well, we'll try something there. We send our tanks over, they blow up. Whoops, they have gas tanks in them. We got to fortify them against the German shells, get something else to work. A successful war involves lots and lots of mistakes, but then quickly learning from those mistakes. And that's obviously what we've seen now. The plans and the forecast that we saw in March have just been completely blown up. And now our governments, they're making it up as they go along, as every wartime government does. But the key is to stay open so that we can respond to circumstances and understand things. Certainly the war on terror was another great example. We went in ready to fight Vietnam again, and our adversaries had something different. And it's really amazing how quickly the U.S. military adapted, thought through new strategies, new doctrines, new ways of fighting this thing. Well, we're certainly going to have. We've already seen 3 or 4 plans fall completely apart, and more will come. The great advantage of what we have now over war is openness. In a war, you have to keep secret about what you're learning and how you're adapting your tactics. Whereas the great hope I see is not in the competence of our bureaucracy, but our wide open internet, which is allowing us to read academic articles as they're instantly posted, think about them. Ideas of how to run this are bouncing around, filtered and filtering up far more quickly than in any previous occasion like this. So that openness may be just what it takes to help us adapt, because certainly the current plans are not going to last another month.
Right. Well, it's the famous quotation from von Moltke the Elder, right? No plan survives contact with the enemy. And I'm thinking of the late great historian Michael Howard, who sadly passed at the end of last year, who really made the point oftentimes that you're never going to get it right, no matter how hard you think about the problem of future war or maybe future pandemic. You're not going to be precisely right. The key is to not be so far off the mark that you can't adjust once the real dimensions and nature of that challenge are revealed to you. And the way a virus morphs, I think, is kind of analogous to the way enemies will fight us, our forces, asymmetrically, right? And these conflicts evolve in ways you don't really understand. Hugh Strachan, another great military historian, said that wars oftentimes turn into a different kind of war, morph into a different war over time. And so I think it does work. I mean, to Neil's point that you made, is that how few Americans seem to be directly knowledgeable of the experiences of our warriors in combat overseas. I think it's a problem. I mean, I think that Americans don't understand well the nature of the wars that are ongoing. I think it is interesting to at least point out that the president said he's a wartime president about the pandemic. Well, we were already actually at war in Afghanistan and in the Middle East before he made that statement. So I think it is to some degree a manifestation of a misunderstanding of the nature of war and the character of the conflicts that we're in now. What is at stake, and why it's important for us to remain engaged against our enemies. Of course, in the world wars, World War II in particular, every family had a family member in harm's way, and so it was quite easy for everyone to remain engaged in what's happening. In terms of this idea that you can predict years in advance, the course of events, I mean, I think what's extraordinary, for example, is how the wars have been waged in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, as President Obama announced a reinforcement of troops there, he announced the timetable for their withdrawal at the same time. So unless you give your plan to your enemy and say, "Hey, please adhere to this script," it's ludicrous, I think, at times. I mean, I think if the great captains of history were to come back and look at how we've waged the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they would be appalled.
We sent troops to Europe, and the plan was, we're going to leave these troops here until surrender, and we don't know how long that's going to be. There's one more military analogy that I think that is very appropriate that you guys have sort of touched on. I think lesson number one in military is don't lose. Survive to fight another day. Take the battlefield setback, but don't let them overrun you. And that is in their sort of economic aspect of this pandemic. I'm a little worried that our plans go through September, and then it's all over in September, and people will pay back all these debts, and then everything will be fine in time for the election. You need a plan B for what happens if the enemy hits your right flank and overruns them, a way to withdraw, a way to recoup, a way to learn lessons and keep going. And I'm not sure if we can keep going past September, October into the new year with this.
Mm-hmm. Gentlemen, I'd like to ask you about something that Neil sort of brushed on, and that is the idea that wars are not shared by a generation, that some people fight, other people are on the sidelines. Are we looking at perhaps the possibility of reintroducing some form of conscription in this country, a draft, if you will? And I know this is enormously complicated because of exemptions and what form of service and so forth, but if you want to bring together a generation and have them share an experience, don't you need to consider, say, some form of national service or some form of a military draft?
Well, I think that's an idea to be resisted at the best of times and at the worst of times, and I'm pretty confident.
So I put it out there.
Agree with me on that. There's a reason we went for an all-volunteer force, and that was because it was very clear that the draft had broken down irretrievably in Vietnam. I think there's a different question really, and that is, what is it that we need people to do right now? And we do actually need to hire a substantial number of people to help with the challenges of testing and contact tracing. It's not like a conventional war where you're going to draft a whole lot of untrained people, quickly put them through their paces and send them into battle. You can't train doctors that fast, and you can't train nurses, but you can probably train contact tracers pretty quickly. I don't think that necessarily requires the draft, though. I think it just requires the government to say the census isn't happening, but instead we've got these jobs that we really need to have done well.
I'll emphasize, I mean, Milton Friedman was the famous advocate of no draft, and I think he got it right on many, many ways. Draft is about, we want you to do stuff and we're not going to pay you what it takes to do it. And right now, money is not the problem. We're spending trillions and trillions of dollars and yet falling apart for the lack of 5-cent face masks. Yes, unemployment's a huge problem. We're paying millions of people to stay home. So we might as well pay those millions of people to go do the cleanup work. That there's all sorts of low-skilled work that needs to be done. You don't need to go literally with a gun to their heads and say, you guys do this. The argument for a draft that it makes people feel wonderful about their country. We'll ask any draftee about just how that works in practice. If we are not creating a civic body in this country, and that problem lies with the public schools who don't teach anything about how this country works, not with the lack of taking people by force and making them be in the army for a couple of years. So I agree. The draft is not the answer to any of these questions, especially right now. Oh, HR, maybe you just.
I would just say, the greatest strength, obviously, of our military services are the men and women in uniform. They are extraordinary people. They are dedicated to the mission and to each other. They want to be there, and they volunteered to serve their country in time of war. That represents a power that is impossible to quantify in terms of the professionalism, the cohesiveness, the ethos of self-sacrifice, willingness to sacrifice for each other and for the country. And I think that's what makes our military so powerful today, and made it so powerful since the time of the all-volunteer force, coming out of a very difficult period of the post-Vietnam period, a war and the personnel policies in that war that it just about broke the military services, especially the Army. And so having come into the Army with this great gift of a renaissance really already underway from leaders who had seen the pre-Vietnam Army and helped put in place the professional force we have today, I don't think we can give that up in terms of combat effectiveness. And it's hard, it's hard to have people, to bring people into the military and build cohesive, effective teams if they don't want to be there and want to be with each other. I do believe, though, that service, national service, is important, because I think what that does is it really helps create a common identity among Americans, and also it fosters an ethos among all of our citizens that they can make a difference in real people's lives, and they can, and it also it incorporates, I think, inculcates across our society a willingness to serve broadly. There's just recently completed a national commission on national service, a commission on national service. I think their findings are pretty solid. I think that's an opportunity. Programs for serving underserved communities, I think, is immensely important. Programs like Teach for America, other programs. I'm working now with an organization called the U.S. Civilian Corps, which is meant to do something very much like what Neil and John are talking about, is to identify where are the needs once a crisis begins. What people with what sorts of skill sets need to be mobilized and moved to that area of crisis, and can we identify those people in advance and organize them, in the appropriate database and so forth, and then work on some of the other barriers that prevent people from being able to volunteer quickly. For example, the licensure requirements across states for nurses and doctors and other healthcare workers. So there's some very good work going on in that area. And I think I mentioned on a previous episode, I'm privileged to work with sort of a self-synchronizing group of people who've come together to try to work on this problem, really in time for a second wave if it comes, but then also to put this kind of a system in place that would allow us to respond to another pandemic, but also other natural disasters that require that kind of a rapid response beyond maybe what the military can provide.
But if I may, let me channel my inner progressive for a minute. This crisis is they say increasing inequality, but there's a split between the America who, like us, can quietly Zoom from home, keep the paycheck going in. And then there's the America that is out there, delivering food and being our hospital workers and our janitors. And they're the ones who are getting sick from this. And they're the ones who are getting hurt from this. Now, national service, that is the same divide between the upper crust of America that disparages the military, is profoundly unpatriotic, who looks down at the whole business. The Google employees who want Google not to have any military contracts is an example of that divide. National service, by sending the same kind of patriotic Americans who now go into the military, sending them off to go do contact tracing is fine, but that's not where the problem is. The children of the 1% will be studying for their graduate school exams and interning at the tech companies and doing the kinds of things that they do anyway. I don't think forcing them to go do stuff they don't want to do is going to help it. But that cultural divide is real. It's what showed up in attitudes towards the military and shows up in a lot of attitudes.
I wonder if, since Vietnam's been mentioned, I can just jump in and say that I do sometimes wonder if this crisis is having a kind of Vietnam-like impact on American society. It's now killed as many Americans as the Vietnam War did. That was a milestone we passed quite recently. I think more interestingly, it's dividing the country. It's amazing that Americans who seem capable of being polarized on any issue are polarized on whether the virus is actually dangerous enough to justify economic lockdowns. The polling on that shows a really clear partisan division. And there's a growing partisan division on how we're going to have an election if the situation hasn't radically improved by the fall. I sense that one of the worrying features of the situation is that rather as during Vietnam, there is a sense, as John just said, that the burdens of this pandemic are not being equally shared. It is minority communities that are most directly impacted in terms of mortality rates. That's already becoming obvious. It's not just elderly males it's targeting. There's a disproportionate fatality rate amongst African Americans, for example. So I find myself, as I look at President Trump trying to position himself as a wartime president, wondering if perhaps Lyndon Johnson is the role model that unwittingly he's ended up with. This is something that I think will become more of a problem when people are disappointed to discover that it ain't all over by Memorial Day. We have a divided America, and I have a bad feeling that, unlike in wartime, in this pandemic, the divisions are going to get even worse.
But the virus is hitting low-income and minority people in the cities that serve the upper crust of the tech elite. It's not out there in Victor Hansen's Fresno. So the blanket lockdowns are really, there's the urban versus rural, the Trump country, if you will, versus the solidly blue tech cities. The economic impact is being really felt out in rural counties. And I looked up some of the rural counties in California, and they're being told, shut every business down, and there is one case in the whole county. There's not long that they're going to put up with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Hoover is the place to do a lot of the work on ensuring equality of opportunity, and I think that's the way to think about it. Is what on the back end of this can we learn about equality of opportunity, and to ensure that that people remain mobile in terms of being able to make a better lives for them and their children, because they can participate in the tremendous opportunity of America. And of course, we have some of the best economists and political scientists here, those who work in education and those who work in healthcare. Who I think we can rally around this and support other work and come up with really, I think, concrete recommendations. Don't let the crisis go to waste, right? Take a look at all of these, problems that may have been exacerbated by the pandemic, exposed in an inescapable way by the pandemic, and go to work on them.
Mm-hmm. Now, John mentioned Milton Friedman a moment ago, and Neil just referenced the election. And one curious thing about Joe Biden's candidacy is that apparently Dr. Friedman, who passed away in November of 2006, is still living rent-free in Joe Biden's head. Biden said the other day of Friedman, quote, "Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore," meaning that Joe Biden is going to come forward, I suppose, as a champion of a much more expansive, aggressive, regulative government. Two questions here, gentlemen. Number one, is Milton Friedman on the ballot this year? And then second, this is a Niall Ferguson question, is what we're seeing with Biden and the talk of a new Democratic New Deal, is this the pendulum swinging the other way? Whereas we had nationalism in the 2016 election preceded by Brexit, are we now in store for a wave in the other direction with a more expansive government and progressivism on not just a U.S. scale, but a global scale?
Well, I was going to say, this is an illustration of a fundamental problem that a man in his 70s has when he's trying to appeal to a quite broad swathe of the electorate, including a great many young people who have never heard of Milton Friedman and must wonder who on earth he's talking about. And when he references the New Deal, I suspect that there's a significant number of millennials and Generation Z types who really have no idea what that is either. There is progressivism out there, but it doesn't really respond to those kinds of lines. It's much more the progressivism of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that Biden has to figure out how to channel if those younger voters are going to show up for him on election day. So I think this is a good example of the difficulty he's going to have in using language that appeals to the Sanders supporters who are pretty reluctantly going to have to show up and vote for Joe Biden. No, this isn't the way to persuade them, I'd have thought.
Mm-hmm.
I think John? It is. I think it is going to be. So Biden's statements on this, he has to say not just Trump kind of screwed things up, which every general in a war kind of screwed things up. If you look with ex post wisdom, he's got to convince people he could have done better. While Trump was saying we're going to cancel the planes from China, Biden was saying, "Oh, that's racist. You can't do that. That's not going to go down well." Biden has lately been, what's his big focus lately? Well, we have to stop worrying so much about curing the virus, but really focus on the inequality aspect of it. So it's all inequality, all redistribution all the time, without a clear statement of even how would I have fought this virus better. That's going to be, that certainly was the what everyone was concerned about in last summer. But we're going to see how much the inequality and social justice is that important in people's minds in the fall. And yeah, Milton Friedman he's at Verity. Joe Biden might as well campaign against Adam Smith, who is just as right and just as dead. Now, Milton Friedman is sadly not on the ballot. Where is the? I thought this was going to be the libertarian resurgence. I always keep thinking it's like the Chicago Cubs are going to win another one, but nobody is arguing for the wonders of free markets.
Right. I think, Bill, that's where your question was going. That there has been, and I think there will continue to be, a swing to the left, right. As I remember predicting way back when. The lesson of history is that the populism of the right has a relatively short half-life because it's not actually terribly good at delivering what it promises. That the things that are supposed to benefit workers, like tariffs, turn out not really to do that. And then along comes a crisis like this, and the competence of the populace is called into question. And historically, the pattern in the US has been, well, we tried the populism of the right, let's swing to progressivism. And I do think that that's the likely shift that could get Biden elected with all his obvious flaws as a candidate. He just has to have a pulse really on November the 3rd to be in a pretty good position to win this. It's so hard for any incumbent to win in an atmosphere of crisis like this, with the economy, as John and others have pointed out, in as deep a hole as it's been since the early 1930s. It's not exactly the perfect situation for an incumbent to get re-elected, is it?
The populism of the right is organized as sort of loosely around the thoughts of one man, whereas the progressivism of the left has an ideology, a very organized ideology. It has controls of all of the institutions of civic life, the universities, the nonprofits, the Pulitzer Prizes, all of the rest of it. It's an organized movement. It's not just whatever Trump is tweeting right now. Trumpism lasts as long as Trump lasts, and there's very little either organization in the institutions of the democracy, or a century-old ideology that keeps people coming. The hope on the other side, however, is that I've seen many of my liberal and progressive friends wake up to the horrendous incompetence of the machinery of government shown in the current crisis. And do you really trust a government that has been unable to, that you can see the regulations, the CDC, the FDA, the product labeling falling apart? Do you really want to loosen that on the rest of the American economy? So I think that the sort of concerns, many of the kind of fringe concerns, are not going to resonate as strongly this time around. I learned the New York Times was planning a whole big thing on inequality. That was going to be, I talked to a Times reporter about other stuff. That was going to be it for the spring. Inequality, inequality, inequality. Well, they're not doing that anymore because it doesn't resonate so much. So I hope that competence is what we're going to be talking about.
Right. Now, H.R. Franklin Roosevelt first introduced the term New Deal at his convention's acceptance speech in Chicago, July 2nd, 1932, to be exact. And here's what Roosevelt said.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
Note H.R. FDR used words like profits, crusade, call to arms. This is religious, this is military.
Well, as you know, it was a period of tremendous desperation associated with the Great Depression and with war looming, potentially on the horizon. I think that really what is most important when you're facing this sort of this polarization within our society is education, right? Because a lot of these sort of extreme views, they don't stand up to very basic facts and very simple analysis. So I think that the work that we do here, and the series, like for example, the Policy Ed series, I think that's immensely important to communicate to Americans really the facts and the sound analysis that will help them make the right decisions themselves in terms of who they want to lead them, really not just out of this crisis, but into a future of opportunity for all Americans, for example. And of course, what's sad about a lot of the policies that are often proposed in the midst of a crisis is what they recommend as the remedy actually makes the problem even worse. And as John alluded to, the answer to less than satisfactory centralized governmental, maybe federal response to this is probably not to centralize more. Right? It's probably to figure out a way to be more effective of the federal government, shifting resources, enabling a more effective, enabling those who are coping with this problem set at the local level with additional resources and capabilities and capacity. But I think it's an interesting analogy you're sort of making there, Bill, as to the is this the 1930s? I certainly hope not. Because what loomed on the horizon was a disastrous war and great trials really for all humanity. I think what we have to do is do everything we can to emerge from this stronger and to be able to take on, again, what I mentioned, are the problems that may appear to us in starker relief as a result of the crisis. But I'd ask Neil to comment on that.
Can I jump in on this one with a quick thought? I'm glad you brought up the New Deal, because you started us with the war analogies. and it reminds me of our many wars: the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on cancer. Lots of presidents like to declare wars. Boy, it's great to be a leader and get the country going. We lost all of those. And we lost the New Deal. Roosevelt, it was exceptionally effective for getting Roosevelt reelected and centralizing power. But if you remember, it did not get us out of the Great Depression. A lot of scholarship now says it makes things a lot worse. So the temptation to declare wars and to reap the political benefits of doing it are very strong, even when you end up losing the wars.
I wonder just how much we can really learn, though, from 20th century analogies. I guess our natural frame of reference still, even in 2020, to think back. And I'm always reading op-eds and research papers saying it's the 1930s all over again. And it strikes me that this really reveals a lack of historical breadth and depth, because really, in the end, a pandemic's like a pandemic. And it's really more interesting to compare our experience with the experience of other societies that have suddenly encountered new, very contagious and deadly pathogen, and stop telling ourselves fairy stories about New Deals and world wars, because probably these aren't relevant analogies. The last book I did, The Square and the Tower, said it's probably more like the 17th century, this time of ours, a time, after the printing presses had created huge religious polarization and strife, after it had eroded the national sovereignties and imperial sovereignties of Europe. I sense that we're really much more in a 17th century time, when great empires are suddenly exposed for their weakness by plagues, and small city-states, the Taiwans and the Singapores, turn out to be better equipped to cope with the new crises of our time. So I hope I can conclude this discussion by urging us to have a break from 20th century analogies, and especially the 1930s, and stop comparing a pandemic to war when you've got plenty of good historical pandemics to compare it with, for heaven's sake.
I think that's absolutely wonderful. We've been tearing ourselves apart since 1945, and to pretend this is the great national federal government unifying moment is exactly wrong. You're exactly right. In disease times, that leads to internal strife. That always leads to finding, the things we want to avoid, finding the always the foreigners, always the minorities we go after. And these things get won on the local, individual level, not by the grand federal response that sends the tanks rolling across Germany.
Okay, gentlemen, let's end it on that note. Let's exit, though, with a very light question for the week, since we've been talking about very grim topics. And that is for people out there who are hungry for content and maybe want to watch a movie. HR, give them a good war movie to watch.
Well, I don't know if a war movie is a good thing to watch in the middle of a pandemic, but I'm drawn to World War I movies. First, you might begin by reading this book by my colleague Neil here, The Pity of War, which is a great book on World War I. There's a really moving documentary out called They Shall Not Grow Old. And what they've done is colorized old films and the expressions on World War I soldiers' faces, and the interspersal of these clips of the film with interviews with veterans, of course, interviews that occurred years and years ago. It really evokes the human dimension of war and combat in that most difficult of conditions of war in World War I. Of course, 1917 is a movie that just came out on World War I as well. And there are some old classics that are pretty good as well. Gallipoli, starring Mel Gibson, I think, really shows how higher command can make unfortunate decisions. Again, it shows missed opportunities as well as just the horrors of trench warfare in a part of in a campaign that was meant to really break the stalemate of the Western Front by opening a new front, but again just recreated the conditions of the Western Front. And I like really war movies that are maybe less gory and action oriented and more to do with leadership and leadership lessons. Paths of Glory is one of those movies, another World War I movie. in which you see sort of inept, self-serving command, but at the lower level, you see courageous leaders who rise to the occasion and sacrifice for their fellow soldiers. So anyway, I guess one way to get out of a depression in a pandemic is to watch wars about a really depressing war, World War I.
Right. Niall Ferguson, what would you recommend?
Well, in the spirit of getting away from the 20th century, I want to urge people to watch Sergei Bondarchuk's epic realization of War and Peace, perhaps the greatest of all the cinematic achievements of the Soviet Union, and an astonishing cinematic achievement, not least because they had the entire Red Army as the extras for the battle scenes. And the reason I recommend War and Peace is not just that it's an amazing film, but also because I feel as if the pandemic is having the same impact on ordinary people's lives. The war that Tolstoy depicted in his great novel had on the ordinary people's lives of that time. It suddenly comes from nowhere, turns everything on its head. And as Tolstoy keeps saying, it's not really Napoleon that's driving this. It's some vast historical force far beyond his ken. So yeah, War and Peace is my recommendation, and it'll do you good to watch a Russian language film with subtitles.
John Cochrane, you get the last word. I know there's so many war movies out there. Probably a lot of good economics movies too, right?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, Hollywood always makes evil corporations the bad person. I mean, I like the bank run scenes in Mary Poppins and Wonderful.
Yeah.
But I'll go back to, World War II war movies are always good to watch. World War I and II. I love 12 O'Clock High, a great profile in leadership. All Quiet on the Western Front, if you want to see the ordinary soldier. Tom Hanks, D-Day, Saving Private Ryan. Can't miss that one. And of course, Catch-22. We keep thinking how wonderful World War II was and how everything worked. Remember, there was a lot of censorship and propaganda about how wonderful everything works. You want to know how screwed up war planning can be. Catch-22.
I have two wars written down. H.R. took one of them from me, Gallipoli, which is an Australian production. I think it's the first big movie from Mel Gibson. So you see a very young Mel Gibson, and it's this tremendous film. The other choice I would give you is Breaker Morant, also an Australian production about the Boer War, an overlooked war. And that's more about the politics of war than it is actual combat. And that's just, I remember seeing a double feature of that with my father back in Washington, back when theaters were open, actually. So those are what I'd recommend, Breaker Morant and Gallipoli. Well, gentlemen, that's it for this week's installment. I look forward to doing this again a week from now. I hope you all stay safe and stay strong, and take it easy on Cinco de Mayo, Neil.
Thanks, Bill, John, Neil.
Bye, guys.
Cinco de Mayo, everyone.
Okay, that's it for this week's episode of GoodFellow. We'll be back again next week with new topics and new conversation. On the behalf of Hoover's GoodFellows, John Cochrane, Niall Ferguson, H.R. McMaster, all of us here at the Hoover Institution, we wish you and yours the best in these complicated times. Stay safe, stay strong, stay healthy, and we'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you next week.